everyone. Welcome to a new session of the WSD Talks, the meetings of the Western Sephardic Diaspora Roadmap project. And today we'll travel to London to the Bevis Marks archives with a very interesting project, a Nação Hebraica, a project that crosses history, genealogy, digital humanities to make available documents of the Western Sephardic diaspora communities. To introduce us to this project, we have today three members of its research team, Alai Ergison, Ton Tillen, and David Silveira. Alai Ergison is a retired BBC journalist and business consultant. Is currently completing an MA in history at the Open University in UK, entitled Keeping the Faithful, Poverty, Welfare and Cohesion in the London Sephardic Community. He lives in Edinburgh. Today he's going to talk from Istanbul. Today is a very, very international session of the WSD Talks. We have each participant is in a point of the world, in the different point. Ton Tillen is a professional archivist, genealogist, expert on the Sephardic diaspora. He's a former archivist for the Dutch Red Cross, and he's a founder of the Sephardic Diaspora Group on Facebook and host of the biweekly Sephardic World Series on Zoom and YouTube. He lives in The Hague, Netherlands. And last but not the least, David Silveira. He's a retired aerospace engineer and program manager. He's graduated at the University of Edinburgh. And over the last few years, he has combined the genealogy hobby with technical experience and technology to open archives of the Portuguese Jewish Congregation of London and make the treasured documents available for research by all. He was born in Jamaica. He's descendant of an early member of the First London Synagogue, and is now residing in Florida, USA. So now I will give the floor to Alai. We'll begin this very, very interesting, I'm sure that it will be very interesting talk. So Alai.
5 international researchers, 3 of whom are here today, as you've mentioned. Our group came together in the summer of 2021, so just over 2 years ago. And the aim was to use machine learning techniques to transcribe manuscript documents belonging to Sar Hashamayim, the Hebrew name meaning Gates of Heaven, of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London, more commonly known as Bevis Marks, after the street where the synagogue is located in London. So we decided to use the machine learning transcription software Transcribus, which was developed by the Reed Co-op organization based in Innsbruck, Austria, and which is already in use in many national and other historical archives and research projects around the world, including, of course, the Traprink project that Carla is involved with, and which many of you will be familiar with, transcribing the Portuguese Inquisition records. So we incorporated a Nação Hebraica as a charity in November 2022, and received a generous grant from a philanthropic organization at around the same time. And this has allowed us to publish the transcriptions on Reed Co-op's Read and Search platform. And David will be demonstrating that shortly. Now, Transcribus is all about training a model from sample pages, which can then be used to automate the transcription process. And we currently have 2 working models, one for the 17th century and one for the 18th century, beginning in 1732. David Silveira has been leading the work on transcribing the annual accounts of Bevis Marks that begin in 1676. And we've also made a start on the minutes of the Velhos, the elders, which begin in 1732. A little bit about this congregation, Sar Hashamayim. It was formed in 1656 after Oliver Cromwell informally allowed the readmission of Jews to England. And it was established by a small group of mostly Portuguese merchants who'd hitherto been outwardly living as Catholics. And by the middle of the 18th century, the congregation had grown to about 2,000 individuals, and that population remained stable throughout the rest of the century. The manuscripts that David is going to talk about shortly are from around 12 years after the founding of the congregation, and they very clearly document the maturation of the congregation's structures and institutions, and we can see that almost in real time. And he'll be talking, David Silveira will be talking in greater detail about the documents, the technical process, and what we've learned from an initial analysis of the manuscripts. But let me first pass on to Ton Thielen, who's going to talk about the archives that form the basis of this work, and also about the wider significance of the Nação project. Ton, over to you.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Carla, for having us on your Western Sephardic diaspora roadmap. Why did we choose London? London is, in the words of the late historian Gerard Nahon, one of the metropoles or center of power in the Western Sephardic world, together with Amsterdam, Hamburg, Livorno, and to a lesser extent Bordeaux, Willemstad, Kingston, New York. The archives of Bevis Marks are in the custody of the London Metropolitan Archives. Part of its archives have been digitized by the National Library of Israel. Most important, many books of the Mahamat, many books of the Elders, annual accounts, livros de pleitos, livros de contratos. Why did we choose for the annual accounts? The annual accounts form a unique, nearly completely preserved series and spans roughly 200 years. They have more or less the same information every year and the same format, which makes comparison easy. The importance of these accounts have been noted before by Moses Gaster 120 years ago when he wrote his History of Bevis Marks, and by Miriam Rodriguez Pereira, who extracted birth and marriage data from the first 20 years of the annual accounts. But other than that, they have been underused. If each year of the accounts gives us a static picture of the London community, together they form a film. Think of it as stills, which together form a continuing movie. The annual accounts will allow us to zoom in to the level of households, rich or poor. We can trace people's lives through the years, from the moment they start to pay finta to the moment they died or emigrated. We can zoom in on the expenses of the community for its personnel, its religious needs, its safety, its maintenance. David Silveira will talk more about that in detail. But we will also be able to zoom out to the level of the community and see changes in its prosperity, in its population size, and the way it handled the poverty problem. And we can see the surnames of the members change. From Spanish and Portuguese, it shifted to Italian, Moroccan, Gibraltarian, and other names. So the nature of the community itself changed with that. And we will be able to zoom even further out, now to the level of the interactions of the community with other metropoles and with daughter communities in the Americas. It will enable us to chart the movements of Sephardim in much greater detail than was possible before. Archives of other Sephardic communities will add to that in the future. The language model that we are developing copes with Portuguese, but also with Spanish, English, and Hebrew words. And once it's ready, we will be able to use it for other communities as well. Above all, Amsterdam, but also Hamburg, Bayonne, Livorno, The Hague, Barbados, and other communities that kept their records in the Portuguese language. For they all have this Portuguese language with Spanish words and Hebrew words thrown in common, plus local words from the Netherlands, from England, from Italy, from Barbados, etc. And David Silveira will now start a PowerPoint and start this presentation.
Well, before I start, let me acknowledge and thank Ton Thielen for sharing his expertise in paleography and knowledge of the Portuguese communities' archives, particularly in Amsterdam and London, and most importantly, spending hundreds of hours working with us, reviewing transcriptions and mentoring and encouraging this project. In short, this project would not have been started without Ton Thielen. And I'll add my personal reason for researching these early documents. My sixth great-grandfather attended this synagogue in 1693 and 1694, and brought my fifth great-grandfather here to be circumcised in 1694. So I have reasons for looking at it. And in my section here, I'm going to talk about, we've called this Uncovering the Treasures of the Early London Sephardic Community. These are records now 25 years before Bevis Marks was built. So they're called Bevis Mark archives, but they're the archives from the earliest synagogue. We will look at the documents and the technical process that we used, and a very shallow look into the initial manuscript analysis. It's very much compressed and shallow at this time, but it certainly has clues that there's some interesting things to drill into. This is all, our work is currently published on the website shown on here at Hebraica.transcribus.eu, and you can, what work has been published is there to be viewed and searched. We started with the first 5 years of the account books, and this is what we've published so far. The first book was from 1676 to 1678, and it starts with the names of the members and an index to the pages where their accounts are displayed. It does recordings of their offerings, which are voluntary contributions that they made throughout the year, recordings of offerings by foreigners and strangers who weren't members. Later account books, after the first 3 years, they added the spending for the synagogue functions, salaries and expenses. They also added distributions to the poor and for travel assistance given to people. And later, the Finta, which is a monthly subscription, and Imposta, which was a business tax, that were used to support the synagogue and the work that they did with the poor and travel assistance, etc. First account book, and all of them are similarly structured. It's a leather-bound book, about 40 centimeters by 15 centimeters. So it's tall, and the books were the responsibility of the Gabbai. The Gabbai's function was analogous, I guess, to a treasurer and secretary. And in 1676, Solomon de Medina was the Gabbai, and in 1677 to 78, Jacob Jesiron Alvarez. And in the third year, and the other piece of information is that about the first book had 180 pages, and they were scanned from cover to cover, and that's what we worked with. So let's look at an example page. Now this page, I had to split it into 2 images, so it really is 1 page, and you will see it starts at 5436, and in the middle it changes to 5437. Obviously, for transcription perspective, this page is typical of many, and there are many worse than this too, in terms of the hastily written It's got 4 or 5 different hands on the same page. Many non-transcribable elements, the dashes and dots, and things that you don't want to transcribe particularly. And there's very little column and row discipline. So transcriptions, and this, by the way, this was for Isaac Basekera, 1676 to 77. And this made it very important that we had to use special handling to be able to transcribe. And so we're going to talk about the technical process here. And this is the transcribers at University of Innsbruck. We talk about the paleography ground rules, the preparations with pages for transcription, and the text recognition model for training and evolution of the model. And we did then publish on Transcribus Read and Search platform. Paleography ground rules, absolutely important to do manual transcription and then to try and teach the computer in a reasonably consistent manner. We started with the Brigham Young and Transcribus ground rules, and we retain all the abbreviations when we can read them. We transcribe equivalents U, V, I, and J, and sometimes B comes in there as well. We use the best estimate of what the scribe intended character by character, as best we can tell. And we did a bit of tailoring because Portuguese is a language with a lot of contractions, and we separated word contractions when considered helpful to understanding. We did not transcribe uppercase in the middle of a word, and we actually compiled a glossary of the abbreviations, words, and alternative spellings that we have encountered for many of them. So we can take a look at the glossary when we're completed with this. It's fine to have ground rules. It's awfully hard to apply them consistently. So I make apologies if some 115s have not been consistent. We tried. The key to get this to work with these pages was in the page preparation, and we had to manually create the layouts and grids and baselines to guide the software to make sure that we could fill out a spreadsheet. We had to create the columns and the rows for the text, the date, the information, and the currency, pound signs information. We started by transcribing using an existing Portuguese model and manually corrected the transcriptions and trained a new model. We retrained as the new scripts are found, and we currently have 64,000 words in our model, and we had to retrain it at least 4 times up to this point. And the current model results, we have a error rate of 5.6% on the validation set, and the model name is here, and it's very specific to which years and what the community was and what was the content of the model. And we started with earlier versions, and as we add years, we'll change that information. The first 5 years are published on Read and Search, as I indicated, and this is what a typical browsing page would look like. On the left-hand side, having the scan of the original page. On the right-hand side, the transcribed page, and the gray shaded areas show the corresponding script from the left and the transcription on the right. And what did we learn from this? And so we're going to do a manuscript analysis. We're going to start with a bit of information on the accounting calendar, because the calendar tends to be very confusing. It was for me when I got into it. We will transcribe, look at an typical account book page, and then we do keyword searches on the accounts to look for religious functions, expenses, life cycle events, and travel events. And so we'll do that, and that's how we extract the data from it. Accounting calendar. Dates were recorded primarily using the Hebrew calendar, but some years weren't. England was using a Julian calendar through 1752. So some of the Julian calendar was used in some areas, but for consistency and analysis, convert to the Hebrew calendar. So look at their accounting calendar. I've got a graphic here. It starts off with a green band that says our accounting calendar begins in Nisan, the month of Nisan, which is at Passover, 15th of Nisan. And it continues through to Nisan, the 13th Nisan, end of the next year, and that's the accounting year. But it's divided into two portions: the first 6 months and the second 6 or 7 months, depending on whether it's a leap year or not. Meanwhile, the Hebrew year begins at Tishri at the beginning of the second 6 months. So the Hebrew year begins halfway through the accounting year, and the Hebrew year begins about in September, usually September, October timeframe, and the accounting year begins in the March timeframe. So when we see the count pages, they tend to draw a subtotal after the first 6 months and the second total at the end of the remaining 6 or 7 months. Let's go back to Isaac Dasikera's page that we looked at before, and we see 5436, which is 1676 at the top, and we see in the middle of the page where it changes to 5437. So halfway through the year, the Hebrew year changes. Now, when that page is transcribed, this is what it looks like. And this is now, we can take a look at some of the entries on this page, because this is where we really get the data from. The first item is offering for 2 days of Passover, Pascha, which is Passover. Another item, prayer for the healing of Sarah de Moraes. Third item, an offering for safe travel for Saloma Curiel. And sorry, not safe, safe arrival of Saloma Curiel, acknowledges arrival. And for safe travel for Joseph Cohen, he was leaving. So arriving was Saloma Curiel, and leaving was Joseph Cohen. On Elul 27, we have arrival of his brother. On Tesfan 24, we have offering on Gonzalez and Aboaf's passing. And another one at the bottom, number 7, is offering for Meir Rofi. He was an emissary for the Holy Land. Emissaries used to come by periodically and collect from communities to take back money to the Holy Land. So now at the end of the account books, in your account books, they summarize the offerings. And so we look at a summary of promesas. And you remember, these are voluntary contributions. So this is a page where they total the voluntary contributions made by each member for the year. And this is one of the pages I selected. And it's not very readable, but that's still able to work with that. And in transcription, here's what we have. And we see that they collected 67 pounds for the year, and some people gave considerably more than others. But it was clear that the people participated, which is a good thing. Then the imposter, which was mandatory contributions, and this was based on the business turnover, business revenue for the members. So it's based on members' business revenue, and it was used to supplement the voluntary offering. And you'll see quite why, because voluntary offerings gave us 64 pounds. Now, if we look at this, we've got 212 pounds from the mandatory contributions. So it was a way of significantly increasing the revenue for the synagogue so that it could perform its religious and social functions that it did. You can also identify in here that the more successful businesses, and as you go through. In synagogue expenses, and I've got 2 example pages. This is the first one, and it's got a mixture of things on here. I've identified a few. They paid for matzah and haroset for Pesach, and that's at the first item on the list. Then the distribution to the poor on days when there were fasts, distribution to the poor on Rosh Hashanah, New Year, on Sukkot, which is tabernacles, on Purim and on Passover. They identify salaries paid here. A silver plate for presentation to the Lord Mayor of London. Cider and the lulav for Sukkot. I haven't really run this down, but I believe that cider was used as wine was not readily available for ceremonial purposes. And then finally, donations to the Holy Land for redeeming hostages. That was the way of the Mediterranean, and people did have to get captured and were redeemed by the community. Second example page, tax paid to the king, employment of a barber for Lidenhall Street, trim cleaning, rent for the synagogue and the butcher shop, gifts for the Lord Mayor and the king, and guards from the trained bands, and guards, ordinary guards. We found this rather interesting to be. If you look at the Portuguese, it's TREINBANS, and we're finally able, to the help of someone, to run down that these are actually trained bands that were used in the 1670s for guards in London area, and so they also had trained guards and ordinary guards, and then finally a large block at the bottom for funeral arrangements for Joshua da Silva. There are details of the coaches and all of these ceremonial things. Life cycle events, and we're looking initially for births, and we're looking for keywords: brit, circumcision, and for girls we would look at bracha, because they typically would bless. Bracha is Hebrew meaning blessed. Brit is Hebrew for circumcision. So we found circumcisions and female births prior to those reported in the literature, and just by analyzing those offerings in 1677, two examples here: the circumcision of the son of David da Silva and the son of Henricus. We identified in here 102 donations in 1677 associated with circumcisions. Now, obviously, there are going to be multiple donations for the same circumcision, but analyzing that, we believe that there were 24 circumcisions in this year, and for some of them we can identify the father and grandfather quite well. Others we're not so sure. Girls, and the example we've got here, Isaac Barzilay from Mesa for the blessing of his daughter, and it's in the box at the bottom. And again, looking for anything to do with the girls, we would look for Menina, Fila, etc. And of course, you have to look for the abbreviations to recognize them. We found 3 unrecorded female births in 1677. Arrivals and departures, and this is very much initial findings. Again, searching for the arrival words of Indo and Veo. 15 people in 1676, 17 in 1677, and departures 15 in 1676 and 3 in 1677. And some of these we know went to Amsterdam and to other places. Now, some of the place information is there. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you can tell how many people there were. Otherwise, you can't always tell. But those were the arrivals and departures that we noted. So, takeaway message. We're publishing these transcriptions on the archives, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London. And here's the website address. We're inviting our historians and genealogists to research these source documents we've done a very cursory quick look and dive in and come up with some very interesting findings. And we invite interested volunteers to learn and transcribe with us. And we'd like the Western Sephardic Roadmap item 53107 to link to our website, because it's specifically mentioned on your website, and you could a link to ours would be appropriate. And that's the website that you would be getting to.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the tip to link the collection to your website. It's a good idea, indeed.
I can visit the website. I can show that, and I can also show the glossary if anyone wants to take a look at any specific.
Yes, it's a very, very good idea. Now I will open the discussion about this presentation. It was very interesting. I think that it's a very, very important project, because this information, it's not easily available sometimes, because it's in Portuguese, it's handwritten, and so it's not easy to read to everybody. And this is a way to make these documents more available, and to also to promote these important historical sources that David are very important for very, very different views on the Jewish community of London, the economic, the social relations, the cultural relations. So it's very, very interesting. So if someone wants to put a question to David, Alai, or Ton, you can raise your hand. Your hand, your virtual hand.
Yes.
Okay, I think that we can start with Bruce Cahan.
Hey, David, this is so great. Ali, Ton, so great, this work and the leadership of it. I wonder, when you think about the geographic extent, and certainly David Mendoza and I have talked about this a lot, how do we tie what you're able to do in Transcribus to a geographically referenced set of activities? I mean, obviously the different account numbers will, but the arrivals and departures, for example, might. Have you thought about the geo-referencing for this?
I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but the first problem I run into is identifying people. If you look at the way people assume names, and many had aliases, and often 2 or 3 aliases, and they were spelled differently. So the first challenge is to positively identify the people. And without their DNA, it's really hard to do it through names. I'm going to let other people take a shot at that. So if we can be sure about a name, we can be sure that we're in London. We can look at what years they were members of the synagogue. We can look if they were on the list of people who received the help from the community, or we can look and see if they were actually paid to travel, go give money to go somewhere else. So those things, but identifying the person is the first issue. Being positive that you've got a person, at least. Second thing, we don't always have location information as to where they came from. So we get a when, and they came, and they may have come from Portugal, or they may have come from Amsterdam or Hamburg. With this, maybe there are other sources we can tie together with this and get a better answer. But this is a single source, has its risks just because of the name problem and the place problem.
I would agree exactly that. I think it will be possible one day, Bruce, it will be possible to do this, but it's dependent on collecting lots of different transcriptions from lots of different communities like Livorno and Amsterdam and Hamburg and all these other places. and then doing the record matches, the name matches, which is, again, as David said, a problem in itself. But it's not something that can be done immediately or using just one set of sources. It's a much more broad project, and of course that needs manpower and finance
And AI.
and AI. Yes.
I think that David Mendonça also wants to put a question or maybe observation about this discussion.
First of all, an observation that Patricia Murieta Flores, who previously, of course, spoke to your group in Lisbon, is going to be speaking to Sephardic World on the 21st. And hopefully, you know, some of the technologies she's working with will answer Bruce's question. My question is, to be honest, Carla, as much for you as for David and Ali and Ton. At what point can these various projects using Transcribus all be put together and coming up with some bigger thing? I understand in Germany they've got about sort of 50 projects and they've put them all together. I'm just sort of on the fringes of this. I'm not really understanding the technology.
Yeah, I think that it's a very good idea. And at the moment, I was telling before begin the session that we have already 5 Portuguese models in the Transcribus, and some of them use very similar handwriting, so maybe it will be possible to combine. I don't know. I think that it's a good idea, and maybe to think in the future to do this synergy between our projects. I think that Kevin Soares also have. Kevin?
I was wondering if someone else wanted to answer that question before I make my question.
Oh, okay. I don't know if Ton
not-
or David wants to say something about this suggestion of David Mendonça.
It would be great.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I have 2 questions. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. And the first one is related to, have you tried or do you have an impression if this model can be used outside the Sephardic community documents? Because it seems to me that at least the accounting, the sort of the more economic related documentation, it's quite similar to other institutions that we have, at least in the Portuguese world. I was thinking about the Misericórdias, the Holy Houses of Mercy, that I think they are the same. So the structure is the same. So, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on this. And also, I've noticed this in the project where Carla also participated about the transcription of Inquisition records. It seems to me that these projects always have very, let's say, positive learning curve in the beginning, and then they sort of become, the model becomes stable. So I was wondering if this is a correct impression, or if you have some sort of documents that have other learning curves, or what you can say about this. Thank you again.
Well, let me talk about the learning curves. What we have found is that as we go along, we find new handwriting, and the error rate, you have to correct the transcriptions, starts to increase. And at that point, you make a decision, well, I retrain, and it learns that next person's handwriting. Obviously, I'm sorry. So that's kind of a train as you go and learn as you go is the only way. Because if the computer hasn't seen the handwriting before, it'll make a guess, but it's not going to be really very accurate. So accuracy based on how much training you give it on a particular area. And the other question, I was trying to remember, what was the other question you were asking? The first question.
Whether this can also be used for non-Sephardic accounts, which
Well,
are
the
very
accounting. Okay. There's nothing I've done here that's specific to the accounting other than draw the boxes to put the figures in the right place on the table in a spreadsheet when you're finished with it. The transcription is learning the text and the numbers, but not the relationship in the boxes and the columns and the rows. I have to teach it that. Now that's because there's not a lot of discipline in these years, and the rows and column discipline was horrible. But if you have work that's put on a form that has consistent horizontal and vertical axes, you can actually train the model to learn that framework you train the transcribers to learn the table that you're working with, and you can transfer that table to over as a template over additional new pages. So that much you can do, but the text wise and the numbers is really what transcribers is doing. Maybe that's answered your question. I hope your tables are well structured.
If I may jump in, David Severa and I tried to apply this model to a few pages of the Amsterdam archives. And these pages have rows and rows of names, and also they mention sums of money, and it worked nearly flawlessly. But I must say we used some easy pages, and we only had to spend a few minutes after that in correcting them. So it's also transferable to other communities, to other tables, to other settings, and it will only become better. I do think there is a natural learning curve always, resulting in the sloping of the new things that can be learned. But of course, you can never get to 100%. And at some point, we will have to make do with a certain margin of error, preferably less than 5%, preferably even less than 2%. I wonder if we can reach that, but it certainly would help very much, because then we can change over to mass production of transcription of pages and do a whole book in a few hours and leave the results as they are, including errors, and leave it to the public to find them and correct them.
Can I
And
add
how
to
many?
Ton?
Oh, sorry, David.
Add on to what Ton was saying, but the 17th century is particularly bad because the standards for spelling and handwriting were really not very well established. And other than when I look at the Inquisition archives, the handwriting was fairly consistent. Some of the pages I looked at, but the pages I'm looking at, it's all over the place, and the spelling is all over the place. So that you have to sound the words you see, and then you can come to the conclusion what the writer meant. But the use of S's and Z's and U's and V's and B's and I's and J's all over, and not even regardless of that, the spelling was going to be different anyway. So this is why this is a labor of love right now. It really is. It takes I can get a good page done in 20 minutes or a bad one done in 4 hours, just to get one page out of the system. But for me, I look at it and there's enough interest in what I'm reading that from a historical perspective, I will take the time to do it. But it's in the later 18th century, I think there's much more discipline in the writings, and we ought to be able to go a little faster than that.
Yeah, I was wondering how many handwritings do you have in the account book, in this account book? more or less?
How many? I would say probably have 10 in the 3-4 years I've done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
You'll
I
see,
think that
you'll see.
no, it's
you see
you
some,
are sorry, please.
in the middle of the account page, which already has 5 scripts, you've got a new person comes along and he gets one line only, and then every that date and that particular year, and everybody's page, he's got this one line. There's not the I didn't mention this, but the discipline and the recording of the promises, the offerings, was very, very loose. But in the discipline for the expenses, they were very accurate. So the person who wrote up the expenses took a great deal of time to write that up very neatly. And I didn't show it here, but in the years that I haven't shown, we've got some really good examples of that. Okay.
Yes, and I was wondering about what you are saying about the spelling, because in the records of Sephardic communities, London, Amsterdam, the Portuguese is not very consistent indeed, because it's very. Do you have abbreviations or not? Do you found abbreviations or?
We've lots of abbreviations.
Yes, and how you are dealing with it?
As written, we transcribe as written.
Okay.
And that's why we have a glossary that explains, tries to explain the abbreviations.
Oh, okay.
And the glossary will also expand as we go along.
Can I just add something here as well? I think this kind of neatly ties into how this project can be developed using the emerging artificial intelligence technologies that are coming out, like GPT, ChatGPT, GPT-4. Because what I try to do, for example, with a sample document from the 18th century, from 1843, was to transcribe it using all the abbreviations and odd spellings and so forth, and then asked GPT to convert that into modern Portuguese. And it recognizes it because that is trained on such a large body of words that it sort of understands what words should follow on from another. So it understands a lot of the abbreviations and what it should be at that point. And then you can, if you want, use that modern Portuguese and ask GPT to translate it to English. And, I didn't compare it word for word, but it really sounds and looks very plausible and accurate. So I think this is something that moving forward, that not just the raw transcriptions, but the processed transcriptions will become much more important in terms of understanding the content.
Okay, I think that we have another question. Jacob, please.
Yes. I have a question about how it copes with different alphabets in different languages. It's Latin alphabet and Hebrew alphabet, if you have Hebrew words in it. Because also in Hebrew, there are different ways to write the same letter. I have something in mind. It's not for this discussion, but that doesn't manage to cope with it, or you have to stop and then to switch to something else. Thank you.
I think I can take that. In what we've been working with, the Hebrew that was used was transliterated into English. It's Arabic characters, so there's no Hebrew characters. But there are people working transcribers with Hebrew characters, both in the formal block text and also in handwritten. So whatever you teach it, it will learn and it'll do what you taught it.
Thank you.
More questions?
I'm mulling over David Silvera's. We need an individual's identity, a persistence of individual's identity, and I do wonder, from our forensic friends in law enforcement, how the attribution of identity, or the maturation of the attributions of identity, using different names, et cetera, how that is converged for these purposes and could be used for these purposes, so that you do have different names in different places. And to Tan's point, and I guess Ali's, if we have enough different located records, at some point, there are not so many Sephardic Jews that you couldn't figure out who is the same person. But you need to train, you need to store a probable identity and then mature your confidence in it, I guess, David. I don't know how law enforcement does that.
I'm going to make a remark, and then I know Ton would probably want to say something about this, but what Ton collects signatures, which is one of his ways of doing the DNA equivalent. In my case, what I've done is if I find a signature and I will use it as a way that is the way that person wanted his name spelled, put it that way. And other writers will spell his name several different ways, but that's the way he wrote it, and that's what I will use if I wanted to choose something. But I'm not doing that because I'm going to write what was presented. So I'll see Alvarez spelled many, many different ways, you know? It could go from there. Okay. Don?
Yes, we transcribe names as they are spelled, and that's for the purpose of learning transcribers to recognize the text. Strange noises here. Yes, we transcribe them as they are, and David Silvera made an interesting point. Some people, among whom I count myself, use signatures a lot. It's often the only personal thing that we have of a person, and if we find the same signature in different places, then we can be more or less sure that it's the same person. It still might be that the same person uses two different names for his signature. For example, Isaac de Sequeira was also known as Alfonso Rodriguez, Gomez Rodriguez. And if he signs as Alfonso Gomez Rodriguez, there are also all kinds of personal things, the way he writes letters, that make it able to compare to Isaac de Sequeira. But for that, you have to have signatures, and you have to have a database of signatures, and that's a bit of a problem, because it's very difficult to find a very simple database that accepts pictures and knows how to compare them. Personally, I use Excel, and I take a signature and I make sure that it fits into one cell. So I have large cells, and then you can play with it. You can sort signatures, names, etc.
Combina, véia, escrava.
Okay. Sorry.
But that's one way to do it. But if you have no signatures, you have to have lots and lots of mentionings of the same name. And another thing that you can say is that the same name will pop up in London, will be there for a few years, then disappear without there being a burial record. And if that same name then pops up in another community like Amsterdam or in Jamaica, it may be the same person. But
Well, and
that takes a lot of time.
as you've taught us, Tan, the date bracketing on lives is also
As balzaca aí, que roda na pica de monte de marmanjo aí, aí depois quer um trouxa para casar. Nossa,
I'm sorry, I don't know what is happening.
I was saying that together with the signature database, you would have a dates database, and at some point, there's a bracketing that the date reconfirms and the place reconfirms a probability of identity. But you know, that's what you've taught us.
Yeah, I think David Mendoza can maybe able to say something about that.
I'm not really sure I've got very much to add beyond what Ton has said. I mean, we're working on it, and we're just essentially creating sort of sets of rules so that we can sort of narrow dates down.
Okay. I don't know if there is other questions. Maybe not. I have a final question. I'd like to know the future projects, namely which documents do you hope to transcribe next after this account book? I don't know, the minute books, the despachados lists. I was looking to a light. It's I don't know.
Maybe I can partially answer
Yes.
that. So David is leading the sort of transcriptions of the early account books, and I think the plan is to go up to the end of the 17th century, and then we've already got a little bit when we were training the model. We used a little bit from the beginning of the 18th century, but separately, I used the Askamot, the constitution of the community from 1732 as a kind of basis for training, because it's very, very clearly written. You know, it's much easier to sort of transcribe, and that is done, and that's been published on the Regent Search site. So you can look at the 1732 Askamot, and then using that as a basis, I've started to transcribe the minutes of the elders, which also coincidentally start in 1732. That's the first ones. And there are 4 books, I think, 3 or 4 books. And I did about 50 pages of the first book and maybe 25 pages of the second book, but the other way around. But I've had to park that at the moment because I need to get on with other things. But I'm hoping to pick that up again later in the year. So that's my plan anyway, because I need that for my own research. It's very useful for my own research. So I'm looking at the minutes of the elders, but that'll almost inevitably make it much easier to transcribe the minutes of the Mahomet, which in the same years will be using the same hands, same scribes. So that's really where we are at the moment. But it all depends on getting more manpower, I think, therefore I'm going to echo David's plea at the end of his presentation that if anyone wants to volunteer to help with the transcriptions, we'd be very grateful for that help, because we're a small trained band.
That's a good way to put it. I'm sticking with the earliest books because everything which the later years have been well researched and documented in text, and some of the early ones as well. But the very earliest books are the ones that are harder to do, and they also contain information that's not as readily available. So.
Okay, thank you a lot. Thank you, Alai, Ton, David. It was wonderful. It was very interesting. The discussion is also very interesting. Sorry for these interruptions. I think that Bob is right. We were hacked during the session. Finally, to finish, I only want to let you know that the final workshop of the Western Sephardic Diaspora Roadmap will take place in Lisbon, November 28th, but it will be also broadcasted by Zoom, I think, or YouTube, and then you can also take a look in our workshop. Thank you for you and for this presentation. We'll see you.